Greetings all and welcome. Delighted to have you back for this third gathering of the London Book Club series with Professor Ian Newman from Notre Dame. As most of you know, I'm Father Jim Lease of the Congregation of Holy Cross, and I serve as academic lead for the Notre Dame London program. We're delighted to welcome you to this third of a four-part series of the London Book Club entitled London in Song. As we begin, I want to thank the partners of the London Book Club, the College of Arts and Letters, the Office of Notre Dame International, the de Bartolo Center for the Performing Arts, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the Keough-Naughton Institute, Notre Dame Learning, and especially the Notre Dame Alumni Association. And thanks to all of our co-sponsors who have contributed so much time and talent to bring this program to life and assisted us throughout. We're delighted to have such a large group registered today. An untold number are with us, and more have registered, and we'll see it taped. And as such, we ask you to use the Google form that we're sending to the chat box. There's a link in the chat box for the Google form, and if you click on that, you can submit your questions throughout the program for Professor Ian Newman and his guest, Jason Whitaker. We will try and answer as many of them as possible or get to them as time allows. In the event that we don't get to them all, we do have a private discussion board on LinkedIn where we invite you to participate in the conversation in between the live sessions with Professor Newman. And now I'd like to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Professor Ian Newman. Many of you are with us over the past 2 weeks, but for our newcomers, Ian is on the faculty of the English department here at Notre Dame. He has been a visiting scholar at King's College London for a project called Music in London, 1800 to 1851. He has also lived in London for about 5 years and has written extensively about London in various articles and books and digital projects, including the book, The Romantic Tavern, which uncovered the history of London taverns in the late 18th century. You can imagine how delighted we are to have him guide our newest London Book Club series. I'm particularly excited about this program as Jerusalem is one of my favorite English anthems. As you may know, when we promoted this event, we shared a few pre-recorded videos and texts that are posted on the ThinkND website, where Ian provided a great overview of our topic. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch it, I recommend going to ThinkND when you have a chance and reviewing those materials. Ian, the warmest of welcomes to you and to your guest, Jason Whitaker.
Thanks so much, Father Jim, and thank you to everyone for being here once again. I'm really happy to see everyone and now increasingly familiar faces on screen, so good to see you all. So welcome to the series that explores the history of London by examining the popular music it inspires. Last week we were talking about the song The Jolly Young Waterman, which is a song that emerged out of the 18th century theatre and has somehow over the years stayed in circulation. We were talking a little bit about how that song was transformed from its sort of official performances in the London theatre in the 18th century by the folk process to these more casual and various forms of versions of the song. This week, we're going to be turning our attention to quite a different song, to the thing known as Jerusalem. And we have to pick our words quite carefully here. It's hard to know whether to call it a song, an anthem, a hymn. I'm going to try to use the term song as much as possible because I think anthems and hymns are all kinds of song. But thinking about how we categorize certain forms of song will be quite useful and interesting in this particular case. So the song Jerusalem has become the default national anthem of England. And again, I want to stress that this is England as opposed to Great Britain. When Great Britain gets together and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland are also involved, we sing, well, traditionally, God Save the Queen or King. That is a really interesting song in its own right. We could spend weeks talking about that song itself, but we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about the song that when England alone, separate from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, when at sporting events, for example, that's become the default national anthem. And I think it's still unofficial at this point, but increasingly it's the one that everybody thinks about as the English national anthem. So the song has its origins in the very beginning of the 19th century, when William Blake wrote the words, and then it sort of has a new lease of life at the beginning of the 20th century, when the music that most people know now associated with the lyrics were written by Charles Hubert Parry. So we'll dig into some of that information and think about its composition today. I'm going to be joined by Jason Whitaker. I'm so pleased about this. He's one of the world's leading authorities on Blake, and he's a particular specialist on the reception of Blake in the 20th and 21st centuries. And he is, in fact, in the process of writing an entire book on the song Jerusalem. So there is nobody better to have here talking about this song with us than Jason. So in a few minutes, I'll hand over him, and he's going to talk to you a little bit. And then I encourage you to ask lots of questions, and I hope we'll have a really robust discussion as we did last week. So please use the Google form that is in the available through the chat function at the bottom of your screens. Before I hand over to Jason, though, I really, there's a couple of things that I want to do. Firstly, I want to play you a version of the song. So I will show you the video of the royal wedding, which I talk about a little bit on the online materials that I shared with you. But I also want to really quickly recap some of the things that I said in the online videos for those people that haven't had a chance to look at them yet. So the first video, I explained a little bit about who Blake was, focusing in particular in his relationship with London. This is London in Song, and this is an odd song because it doesn't mention London in any way. But Blake is known as a London poet. So thinking a little bit about the relationship between Blake and London, and how London might at some level feature in the way that the song was conceived is quite important. So the first video talks about that. The second video talks about some of the philosophical context, I think, for the song. And I talk about Blake and his sort of anti-materialist, anti-empirical tendencies, and his sort of fight against sort of scientific rationality, emphasizing rather the imagination and the forms of experience that you can have when you open your mind out beyond what he thought of as the constrictions of the five senses. So that a lot of the metaphors in the song, for example, the metaphor of chariots of fire, have a kind of materialist basis, but then have this kind of deeply metaphorical sense too. So chariots, yeah, they're real. They're actually a thing, a material thing, but they're chariots made of fire, which don't sound especially comfortable. So what do we do with that combination of metaphor and materialism? There's an online essay that I wrote that briefly sketches in the relationship between the song and the music, focusing a little bit on the poet Robert Bridges, who included the song "And Did Those Feet in Ancient Time" in his anthology, which was called The Spirit of Man. It was then passed along to Parry, who then took it up and wrote the music, which was originally performed at a Fight for Right meeting. This was a meeting in support of the troops for the First World War. And then it gets passed along to the suffrage movement. So it then goes from the Fight for Right to suffrage, and then becomes an anthem of the women's suffrage movement and the Women's Institute after that. And then finally, I talk about the royal wedding performance, and what does it really mean for this as a hymn to be performed in Westminster Abbey by the monarch and all her friends and a whole bunch of aristocracy, when Blake's politics and philosophy was very much against a lot of what the monarchy stands for. So how do we read the song in that situation? Okay, so let me now introduce Jason Whitaker to you, and then I will play the royal wedding version and then hand over to Jason to speak. So Jason Whitaker is the head of the School of English and Journalism at the University of Lincoln, and his main research, as I've already mentioned, are in the reception of William Blake in the 20th and 21st century, and but also in developments in digital technology and the impact of technology on journalism. So two really interesting fields there. He's published widely on William Blake, and as I've mentioned already, he's in the process of completing a book on the song Jerusalem and its reception for Oxford University Press, which I'm not sure if you've got a publication date yet for that, Jason, but I, for one, am really, really looking forward to it. Too much of a good thing, you might ask? I will say unequivocally no, because I've had conversations with Jason already about the song Jerusalem and its reception history, where it goes, the channels that it passes along, and it's completely fascinating material. So as you can imagine, I'm really excited to have Jason here talking to you. So I'll hand over to him, but while in the transition from me to Jason, let me play the recording from the royal wedding. So bear with me while I just share my screen and sound with you for 1 second.
See video description for links to songs.
So that is an extraordinary recording. It's so mind-blowing to me to watch Elton John, David and Victoria Beckham sing this song. I would love to know what Blake thought of that, but Blake isn't here, but we do have instead Jason Whitaker, who might be able to give us a few insights into this. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you for inviting me today. So just to answer partially, I refuse always to say what Blake might have thought about something, but I do imagine him spinning towards the centre of the earth from his grave at high velocity. One comment I will just make before talking about the projects I've been working on is that there's an irony an added pleasure for me for Elton John singing along there, because he actually adapted part of Blake's lyrics from Jerusalem for his 1997 version of Candle in the Wind, which was released obviously following the death of Princess Diana, to compare the English Rose of Diana to those ancient feet that walks in ancient time. So Jerusalem, one of the points I kind of want to make, I'm going to keep this talk very brief to then go on to opportunity for more questions and answers. But just how much this particular hymn has been kind of worked into the DNA of national consciousness, and also that there are some very, very particular blind spots which Jerusalem does not encompass this vision of Englishness. A couple of very brief personal introductions. First, a kind of a professional one. I started working on Blake in my 20s as a PhD scholar. And at that stage, I was particularly interested in Blake's use of British mythology, so his links to the ancient Britons and how he sort of brought in people like Geoffrey of Monmouth and these fantastical histories of Britain. And as much as anything, I was kind of interested in showing the un-Englishness of Blake, which leads on to the second personal point. And before the event began today, I was speaking briefly with Father Jim, who mentioned that he first heard it with Chariots of Fire. And I pointed out that actually, having been raised a Catholic in the UK, that was actually the first time I heard the hymn Jerusalem, when I saw the film Chariots of Fire. It just was never sung in Catholic churches in Britain. And indeed, a few years ago, when I started working on this book, my father asked me whether I saw myself as principally English or Irish. My mother was from Limerick. And I was actually saying, well, I clearly am not Irish. I just don't have the voice. But also, growing up where I did and going to school where I did, I felt slightly askance from a lot of the conventions, if you like, of Englishness. So if anything, growing up, I saw myself as Catholic. It was kind of, that avoided the whole question of national identity. So what I'm doing in this project, which I don't have a publication date, but I do have a submission date, which is coming up far too quickly on the 1st of March. I'm hoping that this book will be published next year. And how I usually describe it, the elevator pitch, is that it's a history of Englishness through the lens of the hymn Jerusalem. So it's 100 years. It takes a 100-year section in particular from 1916, when Parry set the hymn to music, to 2016, particularly around the vote on the European referendum, what's more commonly known as Brexit. And throughout that, as much as anything, I'm interested not just in the hymn itself, but actually as how it serves as both a metaphor, but also a metonym for Englishness. It captures a particular very, very slippery element of what is perceived to be national consciousness, and actually which I thoroughly problematize, but for a very simple reason that I hope to demonstrate briefly today. And to do that, I want to pick on 3 incidents. Actually, there are 4, but 2 of them are very close together. So the first is very briefly to touch upon the incident, which I know Ian has included in his lectures and his online talks, about the circumstances of the hymn being written. The second is not actually to repeat the very useful material that you'll find that Ian's produced on the composition of the hymn, the setting of it to music by Hubert Parry in 1916, but actually a couple of very small details which draw attention how at this early stage Blake's intentions were being quite, well, I was going to say deliberately, they're probably unconsciously, but being distorted away from his original vision, not by Parry, but by the circle who surrounded him, who wanted to create this vision of Englishness. And then finally, I want to touch upon 2 related events. One, which is the use of the hymn in the 1912 London Olympics, and then 1916 as part of the background noise to the European referendum. So I say I'll deal with each of these very, very briefly, and I kind of just want to illustrate 1 or 2 points in each case. And really then just as hopefully a prompt for some discussion about the meaning of this hymn. During the course of writing this book, which has taken the best part of a decade, it's one of those moments you go, have I really spent that long on 4 quatrains, on 16 lines of poetry? I collected, I mean, the kind of the data set that I collected in the end amounted to nearly 2,000 substantial references and recordings of Jerusalem over that 100-year period. And there are more. That I basically stopped collecting stuff and decided I had to write about this. It's appeared obviously in movies, in television programs, in commercials, in radio plays. It's often this very quick way to indicate a vision of England, which actually when you start to pull at this thread, the golden thread that Blake says he will provide to lead you to the gates of Jerusalem, in his final epic work, Jerusalem, the Emanation of the Giant Albion. When you start pulling that, you realize that it doesn't mean what people think it means. And I'll start with this, the circumstances of its composition. Now, I suggest, it's too strong a word to say that I argue, but I actually believe that Blake wrote this in 1802. It's supposition, but it's based upon a letter written by a man called Edward Marsh to Blake's patron at the time, a man called William Haley. Blake had left London in the early, in 1800. London was become too difficult, too dangerous, but also too difficult to make a living. And he'd gone to live for 3 years on Felpham on the Sussex coast. You'll also notice that I keep using the word hymn unconsciously. I agree entirely with Ian. Song is a better phrase, but actually Edward Marsh, if he refers to Blake singing this air and hymn, which is quite wonderful about the country, and hopes that he can hear it sung again. Now, there are possibly other poems that Blake wrote at this time, but I have a strong suspicion that what's really important about this is that Blake, for the first time in his life, lived, and the only time in his life, lived outside London. And it was in the incredible landscape of the Sussex Downs, looking out over the English Channel, that he actually had his strongest vision of Albion. I believe that without basically that escape from the city for 3 years, he would not have conceived this vision of the giant Albion, of Englishness of Britain. And I'm dangerously conflating those 2 terms. I actually spend a lot of my research teasing those apart. I generally prefer to talk about Albion when talking about Blake, rather than England, rather than Britain, rather than the United Kingdom. But the fact immediately for for one country or one landmass we have three distinct names draws attention to the political complications of talking about Blakean nationalism. So Blake arrives on the south coast, and over the years he has this revelation which directs him. I mean, his work in the 1790s, when he talks about England and Englishness, is actually very hostile. As early as his poetical sketches in the 1780s, the use of the word England in King Edward III is actually quite sarcastic. The English are there essentially as conquering foes. You know, they're engaged in a war of ill repute. In books such as American Prophecy, again, he's on the side of the Americans, the radicals, against the British, against the English. And there is something that enters in 1800, 1802, that transforms his perception of the country in which he lives. The point, and Ian's drawn attention to this, so I'll deal with it very briefly and happily discuss it in questions later on, is that in 1803, a terrible incident happens which radically transforms Blake's life. He gets into an argument with a soldier in the front garden of the cottage where he lives in Felpham. And the soldier returns. I mean, the soldier believes, a younger man, that he's basically going to lay into Blake and easily overpower him. Blake, the act of engraving has made Blake a very strong man. So in his 50s, he sort of grabs hold of this soldier, propels him to the inn where he's billeted. And a few hours later, the soldier returns with a magistrate, and he is arraigned for sedition. He is tried the following year. He's found not guilty, but that is the most dangerous point in Blake's life. And one of the points I kind of make in the book is that what will become the archetypal hymn of English patriotism is written by a man who's seen by the authorities as a potential traitor. And this is fundamental to Blake's vision of Albion and indeed of England. England is not there yet. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. It's not it's often used as, sort of England is better than any other country. That is not Blake's message at all. He is striving to create this system. So Blake's vision of Albion, of England, is intensely radical. The transformation of it into essentially a conservative hymn that can be sung at royal weddings begins, actually, it's not by Parry. Parry has an intensely complicated relationship to conservatism. I mean, he's described by his first biographer as essentially he's either a liberal conservative or a conservative liberal. His personality, his demeanor is intensely conservative, but he's a supporter of the women's suffrage movement. He's a great believer in free trade, in many liberal movements. The transformation of Jerusalem into a conservative paean takes place with a number of figures. Ian's already mentioned Bridges and the importance of Bridges in his collection of poetry, Bridges being the poet laureate. But two figures I just want to touch on briefly are actually Henry Walford Davis, who's the first composer. He conducts Jerusalem at the first performance in 1916. Walford Davis is actually the first composer to set and did those feat in ancient time to music in 1908. So some 8 years prior to Parry's composition. Walford Davis himself was to become the master of the King's music in the 1930s. He was also the first controller of music for BBC. He's an establishment figure who was taught by Parry and held him in high regard. And it's actually Parry with Bridges who actually effectively convinced Parry. It's Walford Davis with Bridges who convinced Parry that he should set this music to set Blake's poem to music. And also in support for Fight for Right, which is this intensely nationalist movement. When I started doing the research into Francis Younghusband, I will happily talk about him in questions. Younghusband was everything I kind of despised about the Victorian Edwardian period. He's the great adventurer. He goes off and he conquers Tibet for Britain, for the British Empire. It's when I start reading about him, however, he did that with about 20 men. They just wander through the Himalayas, turn up in Tibet, plant a flag, and say, basically, you're now part of the British Empire, and wander off with all these Tibetans, that's an old joke, Tibetan monks sort of looking around going, where the hell did he come from? He was also friends with Gandhi. He became friends with Bertrand Russell. He became an atheist later in his life. He's this intensely complicated man who also believed that the fight of the First World War was a spiritual fight. So Parry is brought into this loop, but within 3 months has withdrawn all his support, actually removes the use of the Fight for Rights to be able to perform the hymn, and instead passes it over to the suffragettes. And what this does, and I'll end with the final point, it sets in motion this contested relationship for the hymn Jerusalem. Over the next 100 years, it will often regularly be upheld by the establishment as all that is noble and good and great about Britain, about England. At the same token, it has this long-standing radical tradition that feeds into Labour, into the growth of socialism in Britain. It's invoked, one of my favourite sections in the book that I'm writing about is by J.B. Priestley, who set up an alternative socialist party because the Labour Party wasn't left-wing enough for him, and invokes Blake's Jerusalem. So that what you find is that by the beginning of the 21st century, you have this incredibly contested atmosphere where most people, I think, will treat it as a conservative establishment nationalist hymn. But there is a very, very strong contingent that comes through. And you see glimpses of it in popular events such as the London 2012 that draw attention to this alternative, socialist, left-wing use of the hymn as well. So, bearing in mind our timing, I'll stop there for the moment. But I could pick up a whole hundreds of moments of the use of this hymn over the past century. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. That's so rich. I have so many questions that I want to ask you about. But what I might do is let everybody else submit their questions over the chat. And I really encourage you to go to the chat. There's a form where you can submit your questions either for Jason or myself, or just for us to talk about things that you find interesting. Take 30 seconds, submit a question. And while you're thinking, I'm going to play a non-conservative use of the hymn, just for balance. So this is going to be I just called it a hymn. Did you notice? This is going to be the recording by The Fall. So once again, bear with me while I have a nightmare with technology, and I'll try and share my screen one more time with you.
See video description for links to songs.
Okay, we'll stop there. I could see Father Jim visibly cringing at that. So just to save him, perhaps we'll stop at that point and take your questions. Jason.
Just coming. That version of Jerusalem is actually taken from a 1987 album called I Am Curious Orange, which was recorded by The Fall with the Michael Clark Dance Company as part of an opera celebrating the Glorious Revolution and William of Orange. So it's it's a really complicated, convoluted take on national identity in post-punk records and dance companies of the 1980s.
If ever there was anyone to give you the background into the song, then Jason.
My head is just full of weird stuff like that.
Okay, perhaps we can take some questions.
Now, let me just say, Ian, you're right that I preferred one version over the other. I don't need to tell you which. You mentioned earlier, Ian, that London isn't mentioned specifically, despite the fact that London shaped Blake's experience. What do you think the song tells us about London and Blake's attitudes toward it?
Well, maybe I can start there myself, and then I'll pass over to Jason to see if he has any thoughts about this. I mean, the interesting thing, I think, is the sort of marginalization of London in the song. As Jason was talking about, this is a song that gets composed while he's in we don't actually know when he wrote the words, but it's generally associated with his Felpham period. So as Jason was talking about, the move to the countryside seems to be the thing that makes this an available thought for him, this kind of, you know, the green and pleasant lands bit. And so in a way, it's that vision of nationalism is sort of shaped by the move outside of London, which, as I've explained before, is a problematic place for Blake. It's something that he often denigrates, doesn't like. There's one other part of this, though, that I want to raise, is that Blake lived for a long time in Lambeth, on the south of the river. And there was I think it was a flour mill not far from where Blake lived. And Jason, perhaps you probably know a bit more about this than I do, whether you can fill in some of the details. But it was called the Albion flour mill, right? It was Albion flour that was being produced in this mill. And so this vision of Albion, which we often take to be this sort of bucolic, sort of England green and pleasant land stuff, also has this really important valence of including London at its core, right? So that Albion is both this sort of slightly more bucolic vision, but also deeply urban and part of where Blake lived. The other thing just to say about Lambeth in particular is that if you know Blake's Song of Innocence, the lamb, which is paired with the tiger, lamb becomes a really, really important image for Blake, partly because he spent so much time in Lambeth, which he then associates with lambs and sheep and shepherds. So there are all these sort of bucolic images in Blake that end up having this sort of deeply urban context to understand them as well. On that note, I'll pass over to Jason and see if he has further thoughts about this.
I mean, I would also, I mean, one of the comments I would make is that Jerusalem, and did those feet, which then become set to music as Jerusalem, I think very, very specifically, that's an interesting poem because it's one of the few poems that Blake writes that is not about London. So it's almost, it's London in absentia in this particular poem. But I would also, what's to say that Blake has this revelation, you know, spending 3 years outside London, that changes his perception of England in particular. It's also worth bearing in mind that the London, particularly Blake's childhood, was a much more rural city than we would recognise today. I mean, just above, if you know London as well at all well, I mean, just a few streets north of Oxford Street mark the northern boundary of the main conurbation. The West End, you know, sort of going towards Kensington, etc., was largely farmland, and Lambeth, where he lived, was just half a dozen streets before it went into open countryside. So Blake, in his early childhood, I mean, there's plenty of stories about the fact that his father was a haberdasher and he'd take these deliveries to schools and things like that, and he'd basically be traipsing across fields. He wasn't walking through, you know, tarmac city streets which we encounter now. So there's an element in which, whilst Jerusalem and did those feet deals with a rural vision of England, Blake's childhood is actually primed for that. Another element where I'd say that London comes in absentia is not so much in the poem itself, but the preface, which I know Ian's talked about in his talks. And this, I personally am convinced that this was written after he returned to London, after the trial. Suspect that the verses themselves were written in Felpham, but then after he returns to London, he writes this tirade against hirelings in the courts, the university, etc. These are the words of a man who has been tried for sedition and nearly found guilty, for which the penalty would have been extremely serious. So this, the preface to Milton, a poem, is very much composed in London by this angry man who's returned from the countryside during a time of war. And it deals with the conflicting emotions of living in this city, having escaped to freedom for a brief period of time, but then finding that that freedom was illusory.
What do you gentlemen think is gained or lost in Perry's setting this portion of Blake's poetry to music? Blake seems to have imagined it as a song, but what kind of song, and what might song have meant to Blake?
Jason, maybe do you want to take a stab at that first?
I actually do think a huge amount is gained by Paris setting in particular. There are things over the years. I must hasten to add that as a teenager, I didn't really like Jerusalem. I found it, I had this complicated relationship to Englishness, as I've alluded to previously. But I do think that Paris' success with this poem is astonishing. I mean, a few things to draw attention to. It's in the key of D major. Zadok the priest. It is an anthemic key that's often used to songs of jubilation, of glory, of celebration, and that rising sense that very clearly comes through the music is quite astonishing. I mean, Paris' skill as a composer comes through in a number of ways. There's a very slight anacrusis at the beginning of the sung part. So there's a pickup measure that allows then Parry to emphasize the beat on what would be the last word, the last syllable of Blake's lines. So he's incredibly skillful. I mean, one of the reasons why Bridges wanted him to set it to music is that Parry was extremely skilled at setting verse to the rhythms of music, because the meter and rhythm of music, the meter of poetry and the rhythm of music are not exactly the same, and it'd be very easy to get it wrong. So he's incredibly skillful. It's also, particularly in the original version, which is not the version that you hear, for example, in The Royal Wedding. The version that Parry composed in 1916 is a much simpler song. It's still quite complex, but the aim was that this was a song that could go out into the countryside. This could go out into towns and villages, into church halls, and be sung by, a congregation with somebody sitting at an old piano or organ. And actually it lacks the pomp that we often associate with Jerusalem, which comes in 1923, I think, when Elgar rearranges, Parry orchestrates it for the suffragettes, and then Elgar rearranges it for the Leeds Festival in 1923. And he introduces a much larger orchestra. He introduces, bombast, pomp and circumstance. These are Elgar's key themes. So I actually think that Blake wrote and did those feats. But another important point, Blake wrote it, but he didn't really recognize the value of what he'd written. It only appears in 2 out of the 4 copies of Milton a Poem. He got rid of it in the later ones, one of the greatest poems he ever wrote, and he ditched it. It's Paris setting it to music that actually establishes it in the national consciousness. So whilst I myself have had a quite problematic relationship with the hymn, and Parry himself called it a hymn as well, that's why I naturally slip into that term. Whilst I personally have had a problematic relationship, I think that Paris setting is actually what saves Jerusalem for later generations. It wasn't actually Blake. Blake kind of ditched it. He threw it away.
Yeah, I mean, I find that aspect of it quite fascinating. I mean, just for the uninitiated, Blake invented his own form of what he called illuminated manuscript or illuminated printing. That was a very, very complex way of making sure that he could put words and images on the same page at the same time. In the 18th century, if you wanted to print images alongside words, totally different printing processes. Letters were raised, images were engraved. So letters raised, images went down. And so if you wanted to print an image and a word at the same time, you went to 2 totally different printing shops and were done separately by different teams of people. Blake went to great deal of trouble to make sure that he could include words and images on the same page, and to a degree that's in the video that I was talking about. There's this really interesting thing in the word setting on the page. I have a print here actually that I can just show you. You probably won't be able to see this very well, but this is the plate that Blake made. As Jason says, each of Blake's books he printed himself and hand colored, right? So there's very, very few numbers of them. So, in the case of Milton, there was only ever 4 copies printed, of which only 2 of them had this preface that we're talking about. But what I find really interesting about this, just to flash this up on screen again, I'm sorry if you can't really see it very well, but you've got that dense preface text there, going end to end, really dense lines of words that are really quite difficult to read, frankly, without a transcription into modern type. And then this kind of opening out into quatrains. Right. The point that I made in the video is that it's a sense of going from this sort of truculent argument in prose to suddenly this sort of opening out, this kind of much more spacious, gentler kind of vision. It seems to me, and my hunch about this is that often this is for Blake the kind of things that when the infinite speaks, when the gods speak, when eternity is speaking to you, they speak in song. And again, to refer back to the songs of innocence and experience, the introduction to the songs of innocence is really interesting on this. There's a sort of it's hard to do justice to the poem in a sort of two sentences, but there a piper who says, write a song about a lamb, right? And then there's this weird thing that happens where there's a boy who tries to pipe it and then tries to put it in words and then tries, and there's a sort of strangeness to the fact that it starts off as the infinite possibility of ideas that don't have words associated with it, that are just musical words. But as soon as you put them into words, as soon as the song is about something, so about a lamb, then there's a sort of reduction in the possibility of it. So there's something for Blake about the infinity of song, of music, that just words can't quite capture, which is really weird for a poet. Just to make that point, and the thing that I would just to riff off that for one more second, the thing that's really interesting about Blake is that we know him mainly as a poet. In his day, he was mainly an artist, so he's working with visual imagery. But all of this is about sound, and I talked about this in relation to the poem London. It's all about the auditory. So he's working in all of these media at the same time. And it seems like song for Blake is one of these kind of unifying things that encompasses both images and words and auditoriness. And it seems to be his attempt to get to the infinite or the eternal. So song means a lot in Blake, and I wouldn't dismiss it as just sort of, oh, here's a few things that rhyme. There's a lot going into that idea of the song in Blake.
I'm going to elide two questions now. The first part for you, Ian, and the second part for you, Jason. The royal wedding performance might say something about how the reception, of Blake has proceeded over time, and it's the heights of British establishment. You've tipped your hat to his rolling over in his grave, but I'd be grateful to hear what you might have to say about that. And then Jason, to you, do you have, having heard so many of these sort of versions of this Jerusalem as a song, what might be your favorite performance or genre of performance of that song, and what do you like about it? So we'll go to Ian first, and then to you.
Well, the thing that I think the royal wedding performance signals to me most is the sort of transmittability of song and music. The fact that, and we often talk about these when we're doing sort of close reading workshops of poetry in English classes, that words don't have sort of stabilizable meanings, right? And context can really change the meaning of words, and so I suppose that's the thing that the royal wedding performance suggests to me, is the instability of meaning, both in words and music. It also signals the thing that Jason was just talking about a minute ago, that Parry did a fantastic job with this, right? I mean, he he's acutely sensitive to the words in terms of the word setting, but he has fundamentally changed the meaning of the words in ways that I think are really quite profound. And I think that is what gets registered in the royal wedding performance. But more generally, though, I do think there's something quite important to be said about Blake as an author, who whenever I teach Blake in class, the first thing that I always say is that he was an author that didn't believe in authority. Right, those two words have a connection with each other etymologically, but Blake is always trying to transfer the work of meaning making to his audience. Right, so he creates these really complex metaphors that I never quite know how to explain them, whether it's sort of a centrifugal force or a centripetal force. They seem to suck meaning in and then spit them out again and shower meaning everywhere, right? So they're these sort of vortexes of meaning, and Blake isn't in control of those meanings, and I think purposefully so. I don't think he wanted to control the meaning all the time. And so that royal wedding performance for me is a symbol partly of his success in creating these sort of strange vortexes of meaning that can't be pinned down to any single idea. Jason, favorite performance?
My personal favorite, which I'm probably glad you didn't share today, is by a post-punk group performer called Mark Stewart and the Mafia. They released a version in 1982, a double A-side, Jerusalem and Liberty City. Mark Stewart and the Mafia, they grew out of an earlier punk group and then went on to become kind of very important to the development of dub, if you're a dubstep, if you're interested in that kind of thing. And there's this incredible version in 1982, which a quick revelation here, I used to be in a punk band when I was a teenager and stuff like that as well. So I've also, I kind of very much enjoyed that stream of things. What's particularly important for me about that one is that, first of all, the verses are sung in reverse order. So it literally inverts, it turns the world upside down. It wants to turn the hymn upside down. It's also then, it's a series of cut-ups. So it's a series of samples alongside the voice of Mark Stewart, who sings in this, I think most people would be quite a horrible, reedy voice, but for me is the prophet in the wilderness. This is a vision of England outside the norm, outside in the wasteland, which is where Blake often found himself. But it's also then mixed with some quite genuine affection. There's brass band elements. There are slight there are a number of bars from Last Night of the Proms. So what I particularly like about this poem as well is that in one version, it both includes the familiar, the nostalgic, the heritage vision of Jerusalem, and it's not mocking, it's not sarcastic, is an homage to these things, but at the same time completely defamiliarizes it, alienates it. As I said, it's the voice of a prophet in the wilderness, which is very often how Blake saw himself.
Excellent.
Also probably unlistenable for most people.
I was going to say, we might put those on the link to them on the ThinkND website, and we'll see how well they carry off, but I appreciate that. I'm going to offer you one final question for either of you, but considering the lyrics of this song, what might the structure of the two stanzas of questions followed by two stanzas of committed statements, if you will, lend to the meaning of the poem? Do you feel these questions allow more a wonder or a sense of doubt? Either a sense of wonder or a sense of doubt. What does that say to you?
Jason, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I have actually, it's only over the past year or so that I've come to quite fixed is the wrong word, but I've come to a much stronger interpretation of that question, that structure. It's often the readings of Jerusalem, and did those feet in ancient times. It's worth just pointing out, first of all, that there's a very, very, in my opinion, a very common misconception about those opening questions. The assumption is that they refer to Jesus, that the Lamb of God is Jesus coming to Britain. They don't. I am absolutely convinced that Blake had no idea of that legend, because if he had, it would have been in his work. When he talks about Christ being in Albion, etc., it's very much a mystical vision in the way that, St. Paul, when Saul converted, he had this vision of Christ. It's that Christological rather than historical Jesus, that the vision that he has. And the breakthrough for me was actually going back and rereading Milton's History of Britain, which Blake, I believe Blake read very, very closely. And Milton refers to the legend of Joseph of Arimathea coming alone after Christ's death to preach the gospel. So the feet in ancient time are Joseph of Arimathea. And Blake, his very first engraving that he did off his own back is of Joseph of Arimathea on the rocks of Albion. About 4 or 5 years before he composed the lines and did those feet, he did another colour prints of Joseph of Arimathea preaching to the Britons, which shows sort of Joseph with arm outstretched in this patriarchal pose. If Blake had known the legend of Christ being with Joseph of Arimathea, he would have included him in that picture. But no, so what I think Blake is referring to is this legend, which he believes to be true. Milton didn't, but Blake does, that Joseph of Arimathea brought the gospel to the British Isles in the Roman, the Roman imperial times, and it was one of the first countries to convert. And that for him is really important. So it's interesting. I don't think it is a question about doubt. I think it's the preemptive question that leads to faith. And ironically, I find that the statements in the second half to be more questioning, because they are future indicative. I will not cease. Jerusalem is not here. Jerusalem was. Joseph of Arimathea converted the ancient Britons to Christianity, and this patriarchal religion was the true faith. We no longer have it, says Blake, in the early 19th century. So ironically, I find that the relationship reversed. The first stanzas, the questions, are actually a return to the primitive faith. It is the future which draws attention to the fact we live in a time of doubt and darkness now, the dark satanic mills, which I don't believe actually relate to the Albion flour mill. I think that they're actually, again, it's drawing from Milton. In 1793, Blake did a famous engraving and then coloured it. It's often known as Glad Day, but its proper title is Albion Rose, from the mills where he laboured. And this is from Samson Agonistes, that actually the vision of Albion that starts to develop is actually quite a Miltonic one, hence Milton, a poem where Albion returns in this form. So for me, in contrast to most people, I find the questions actually reaffirming an ancient faith, and the future indicative statements actually full of doubt. We need to do this, and I believe we will, but I don't know when. It's the voice of the prophets. It's Jonah, it's Jeremiah, it's all these figures. I don't know when that future will come.
Marvelous. Ian, we'll give you the last word here.
Well, I have nothing to add to that. That's a great reading. I'm gonna steal that in every class.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sometime soon.
That's so great.
We have a whole show on that. You sound like a theologian.
My degree was actually English and theology, so I'm very interested in this. Yeah.
Well done. It comes through. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I especially want to thank Ian and Jason for their marvelous program. And I want to reiterate my thanks to our sponsors. Finally, there is a group that you don't see on this program, who we call the Backroom Group, that work on bringing this to life, our technicians and others, comms team. So I'm just grateful to them and their hard work. And as we sign off, we invite you to join our community circles taking place immediately following. So just if you stay on, you'll be assigned to one of those groups, and we'd be just for about 15 minutes of conversation, greeting and meeting. We also need to continue the conversation on the discussion board we've got set up on LinkedIn. In addition, for next week, we'd ask that you listen to Vera Lynn's A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square, available on Apple Music, Spotify, or YouTube. In addition, part 4 is now on ThinkND with short explainer videos by Ian, as have been there in the past. And please review those and come prepared to discuss next week. Also, please feel free to share this series with any friends or family. We're accepting registrations throughout the entire program, and each meeting can stand alone, so anyone can join at any time. So thanks so much for joining us today, and God bless.